Mother, man.
This is Harold Schecter. You're listening to Murder, Metal, Mayhem.
Spreading faster than a case of the clap in a trailer court. Able to shatter eardrums within a 666-mile radius. A podcast more brutal than all the rest. It's Murder, Metal, Mayhem!
We have the privilege to be speaking with Dr. Harold Schecter today on Murder, Metal, Mayhem. Harold is a true crime author who has written many books about true crime and serial killers. He's also a professor emeritus at Queens College in New York. He's been on Murder, Metal, Mayhem before and is gracious enough to come back and talk to us again. I have one of my co-hosts here with me, Joey Cashman. How are things with you, Harold, in New York?
Good. Everything's, seemed to be getting back to normal. Not sure exactly what's happening now. But can't complain. Been busy.
Well, you look good. You just got back from vacation?
No, I'm good because I retired a couple of years ago.
That's right. Well, retirement's been treating you good, it looks like.
Yes, especially now that I got my PlayStation 5.
Nice.
That's awesome. Well, Harold, we really enjoyed your latest book, Maniac, about the Bath school disaster. You have a penchant for writing about obscure historical morsels like that. What made you decide to write it?
I actually some years ago, I did a book called Psycho USA, American Killers You Never Heard Of. And it was while researching that book, I came across the story of Andrew Kehoe and the Bath school disaster. Very fascinated by it, given the enormity of the crime. The fact that it was, I'd never heard of it, and, many, many people, even in Michigan, haven't heard of it. So I began to look a little more deeply into that. In Psycho USA, I wrote about, each entry is about 20 pages or so, or 10 pages. I decided it was worth seeing if it could be expanded into a book, and the result was Maniac.
Awesome. Well, Harold, this is Joey of Murder, Metal, Mayhem. Andrew Kehoe definitely meets the definition of a maniac, but why do you think so few people know about this horrible tragedy? And do you think Lindbergh's famous flight happening at the same time might have been part of the reason?
Well, that was a big factor. I weave the story of Lindbergh's really world-changing flight into the narrative. As it happened, the Bath school disaster, which your listeners probably don't know, as I didn't know when I first discovered it, was the worst school massacre in U.S. history. Took place in this little farming community called Bath, Michigan. One of the really respected members of the community, he was on the school board, in fact, a guy named Andrew Kehoe, descended into paranoia and madness and rigged the school's basement with all this World War I surplus dynamite. And set the timer to go off on the last day of school in May 1927. Fortunately, a lot of it didn't go off, or he would have basically killed every kid in the community. But he still destroyed one wing of the school, killed about 36 kids, some teachers. So, it was it was both the worst school massacre in U.S. history and the worst act of domestic terrorism before Timothy McVeigh. And yet, completely forgotten. And yes, one of the reasons that it so quickly faded from public memory is that it happened like 2 days before Lindbergh's flight. The day after the Bath School Massacre happened, it was front page on the New York Times. It was the main story. A couple of days later, the Times had like 16 pages on Lindbergh's flight. And there was nothing on the Bath school disaster. So that's one main reason. I also think, and this is part of the argument I make in the book, that there are certain kinds of crimes that really resonate at particular times in our history. so that, back in the 80s and 70s and 80s and 90s, it was serial murder. That's a little bit faded now. Now we're fascinated by mass, we're obsessed with mass murders. But back in 1927, it was such a bizarre, freakish kind of crime. And it happened so far away from the media centers of the country that I just think, it didn't, again, strike a chord with people. So I think both those reasons account for it.
Yeah, definitely. Now, it's scary to think if all that pyritol had gone off, and I learned a lot about the pyritol in your book, that so many more people would have been killed. And the way you described the chaos at the scene with Kehoe blowing himself up and the superintendent is just unreal. I can't imagine what that would have been like to see for those people from such a small town.
Yeah, well, the thing with the pyritol, again, once World War I was over, the government was left with all the surplus TNT. And so they made it into what they called pyritol, which was kind of a low-grade dynamite that they sold to farmers to help clear their land of stumps and boulders and so on. And every farmer was entitled to buy, I think, 1,000 pounds of it. So Kehoe acquired, I think, 500 pounds of it. He got some additional dynamite. Again, spent weeks at night because he had access. He had access to the school, partly because he was a school board member, partly because he was very handy and he was doing some handyman jobs around the school, sneaking into the school at night and rigging this place. But yeah, I mean, his intention was, again, he had become so paranoid and what criminologists now call an injustice collector. He blamed the community on all these failures, his economic failures, and being rejected when he ran for town office, and so on and so forth. He decided to take this terrible revenge on the community and destroy the school. He was always an opponent of building the school. I should say that back then, these in the Midwest and in the South, throughout the country, there was this movement to do away with the old one-room schoolhouses and build these large, what they call consolidated schools, which went from kindergarten through high school, to give rural kids the kind of education that their urban counterparts were getting. And so, the people of Bath voted to construct this school. Kehoe was an opponent because it meant they were going to raise his taxes, and he didn't have kids. So he was going to destroy the school, but he was also, again, he said about, if his diabolical plot had succeeded, he would have killed every kid in the community. As it was, he inflicted, obviously, this terrible trauma on the community because it was a small town. That everybody, if they didn't lose kids themselves, a neighbor or friend lost kids. And, I mean, it was a terrible crime. I say in the book, throughout the 20th century, going back to the shooting of Stanford White in the turn of the century, there were these crimes of the century, all the way up to, let's say, OJ. But by the time I finished my book, I had decided that the Bath school disaster really was the crime of the century. This cold-blooded murder of all these children. So.
Yeah, for sure. Now, do you think that Timothy McVeigh used Kehoe as an inspiration for his 1995 bombing in Oklahoma City?
I doubt it. I mean, I think probably Timothy McVeigh, like the rest of us, probably had no idea. But yeah, I mean, terror bombings and car bombings and, that kind of terrorism had become, not necessarily in our own country, but terrorist acts like that had become much more prevalent around the world. So, yeah, I doubt that McVeigh, was inspired by Kehoe.
Okay. It is amazing that only days after Columbine, the LA Times referenced the Bath school disaster as the worst in terms of victims. You mention in your book several references to Bath that were made or laid in school disasters.
Yeah, well, sadly, after Columbine and, there's this epidemic of school shootings. And, after each one, newspapers, I think Newsweek magazine did it, they would run these lists of the worst school massacres in our history. And, Bath would always top the list. Of course, Bath wasn't a school shooting. It was a bombing, but, again, it was a school massacre. So,
yeah. Now, in your book, Maniac, you talk about the 1937 New London, Texas school where hundreds were killed in a gas explosion. Do you believe that was an accident? And why do you think that they don't know how many victims there were?
I do think that was an accident. I don't think that was a deliberate act of terrorism the way Kehoe's act was. I can't remember now. You'll have to forgive me. It's been a while since I wrote the book, exactly why the number of...
Well, you actually reference the incident in the book, but you don't give a specific number of victims.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if possibly, something came to light afterward.
It was just that in doing my research, when I do research, I do go back, look at all these old newspapers and so on and so forth. There seemed to be a lot of uncertainty. There'd be one number cited one day and a slightly different number the next. I don't know if it's partly because, just some of the remains, were unidentifiable or what, but, there seems to be a little ambiguity about that.
Yeah, it makes sense. Now, do you think, or what is it about, most people think guns when they think of school violence, and what was it about Columbine specifically that you think sticks out in people's minds like it does?
I think there are a couple of things. First of all, it was the act, that seemed to set off and in a couple of cases inspire the subsequent school shootings. But I also think, I've given a lot of thought to why it is that certain crimes kind of grip the public imagination, whereas other crimes, sometimes equally or even more heinous, basically disappear from the newspapers after a couple of days. And part of it has to do with the trying to figure out exactly how to say this. As you know, and as your podcast is an example of, people are very fascinated by true crime. And when they listen to true crime stuff, they're really, not so much or entirely interested in the gory graphic violence as in the kind of story that's involved, and Columbine, given the characters, given the two kids who were involved, given their relationship, there's something about that whole story that is very, very darkly compelling. Just the way they planned it, it's sort of made for TV, ready material. So I do think that's one of, and I forget the guy's name. So it was Dylan. Remind me of the company.
It was Leopoold and Harris.
Yeah. So I guess it was Klebold, who was kind of a classic. The two of them made a kind of pair that criminologists call a folie à deux. And there have been a number of those, like Leopoold and Loeb or the Hillside Stranglers. You get these two people who eventually probably would never commit these things, but you put them together, they form this very toxic relationship. And usually it's sort of one psychopathic personality and one who's sort of submissive and goes along with it for whatever reasons. And you kind of get that with Klebold and Harris. So again, I think it's partly the enormity of the crime, but also the characters, as I say, the whole narrative quality of how they planned it, carried it out, and so on and so forth.
Right. So how much of a factor do you think that media coverage plays in these acts of violence in our schools?
Well, there's no doubt that some serial killers, for example, and some mass murderers, feed off the publicity. A lot of these people are people who feel or have been raised to feel, like non-entities, and their lives have come to nothing, and they're going to go out in this kind of blaze of glory and make the front pages. And I think Klebold and Harris felt that way. And to some extent, it came to pass. So, yeah, I mean, there have been serial killers who, their aspiration was to outdo Jack the Ripper. But on the other hand, it's not like the media is not going to cover this stuff. So,
right, exactly. Now, you referenced thrill killers Leopoold and Loeb in the introduction to Maniac, and they were kids of affluence that had the world seemingly in their hands. What was it about their crimes that captivated the nation in the 1920s?
Well, again, I think that there are certain crimes and criminals who come to personify, some of the widespread fears and anxieties of the cultural moment. The way Manson was like every parent's worst nightmare about sex and drugs, crazed hippies, and so on. To the 60s without thinking about Manson. Same thing with the 20s. I mean, in a way, you don't think about the 20s without thinking about Leopoold and Loeb. And they were, there was a lot of concern at that time among, mainstream middle class Americans about, what they call the flaming youth, all these jet age kids going crazy and stuff. And, Leopoold and Loeb seemed to be, again, the incarnations of that kind of nightmare. And again, they were fascinating characters, brilliant, wealthy, committing this completely gratuitous crime because, they wanted to prove they were Nietzsche and Superman and so on and so forth. So again, it's a story that has been told over and over again because it has so many of those amazing elements, and then being defended by Clarence Darrow, the greatest defender of his time and stuff. And then again, there's also the sexual element, in terms of their relationship. So, it has all these ingredients. It's like, any best-selling book or movie has to have a number of ingredients to capture the audience. So,
yeah, I was amazed to see that Leopoold had an IQ of over 200. I don't think I've ever known a person that's ever had an IQ that high. That's amazing.
In the University of Chicago when he was 16 or something like that.
Yeah, that's pretty damn smart. So we have an episode coming up on Jane Toppan. How did she earn the nickname Jolly Jane in the press?
Well, I'm not sure the press at the time did call her Jolly Jane. I think that sort of was attached to her later on when people are writing about the case. I don't recall coming across that, contemporaneously. So,
yeah, she's looking pretty grim in those pictures, not looking very jolly, kind of like Belle Gunnis, who I love that book you wrote about her.
Yeah, she never looks too jolly in those. Actually, Jolly Jane, let me take a step back. I think, again, I don't know that she was called that at the time, but she apparently did have, this kind of a bullion personality. She was a private nurse who, won the trust and affection of different people. So, yes, I do think she cultivated, a certain kind of jolly persona. So.
Yeah. Now, what is it about serial killers like Jane Toppan, who was a nurse? You talk about her childhood and some, dark stuff in her past. Was that what made her kill?
Her mother died young. Her father was this alcoholic who couldn't take care of her, turned her over to this orphanage. She was taken into the home, never formally adopted, but she was, they would farm out these orphans. Well, she wasn't technically an orphan, but in effect she was. They would farm them out to do domestic work. One of the things that I have come to believe, is that a lot of serial killers have suffered a lot of extreme humiliation in their childhoods, and excuse me, some of their crimes are a way of both taking revenge on the world and also proving somehow they have this power, because they're made to feel so powerless and like nothing in their childhoods. So, I think Jane was certainly subjected to various forms of humiliation. Partly was her Irish background at a time around Boston when the Irish were really looked down upon. Partly was her menial position. Again, she'd had a difficult childhood. None of it totally explains her homicidal acts. But I do think there are elements of that.
Yeah, for sure. Now, we recently covered the Clutter family murders on our podcast. How influential was In Cold Blood by Truman Capote for writers like yourself doing true crime?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. And by the way, I think Perry Smith and what was the other guy's name?
Dick Hickok.
They're another example of that folio. So, well, to me, In Cold Blood is the gold standard for, modern true crime writing. I remember might well have been the first true crime book I ever read. And I, loved the book when it came out. And in fact, in my former career as a professor, I taught the book in a number of my classes. It's a brilliant book. So yeah, it was very influential. And it also, I'm a great believer in learning from the masters of the form you're working in. So, I definitely, learned things from reading and rereading Capote about, his handling of point of view, for example, when he's switching from one character's perspective to another character's perspective, how he paced the book, how he withheld the revelation of what really happened until well into the book and so on and so forth. So, yeah, it was definitely, I would say, the most influential true crime book on me.
So what is next for you, Harold? What's rattling around in that brain of yours that's going to turn into your next book?
Well, actually, I'm very proud of this. It's actually coming out this week or maybe the next week. I've done a graphic novel
wow.
about our country's greatest comic book artist, a guy named Eric Powell, best known for a comic book called The Goon, on Ed Gein.
Oh, shit.
Oh, no way.
Nice.
Yes.
Called Did You Hear What Ed Gein Done?
That's awesome.
Oh, wow. Definitely going to have to get a copy of that, Harold. What's the best way to do that for our listeners?
Yeah, beautiful book. I actually got my first copy yesterday. 200 pages. The artwork is incredible. You can pre-order it on Amazon. That's what I recommend.
All right. Very cool.
Well, Harold, we just wanted to say thank you for doing this interview with us here at Murder Metal Mayhem. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk to us.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Harold. We do appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure, man.
Mother, man.